Nick, what more can you tell us about the Russian missile attack in Ukraine earlier today? They're still going after civilians. Nothing much has changed on that front.
Look, it's an utterly ghastly scene. Hundreds of rescuers combing through the damage to these apartment blocks where we now know the death toll to be 13, but over 80 people injured. Just bear this in mind, Jim. A totally innocent civilian block here hit by what appear, according to Ukrainian officials, to have been 6 cruise missiles and possibly 16 anti-aircraft missiles fired by a strategic bomber and a stealth jet flying into Ukraine. Now, the cruise missiles frequently used across Ukraine by Russia, the anti-aircraft missiles, some say, being deployed because their inventory of other missiles is depleted because of the intensity of the bombardment we've been seeing. But this isn't the first time Zaporizhzhia has been hit, Jim. This week, it's one of a number of attacks that we've seen, but it forms part of a pattern of what Ukrainians say is indiscriminate bombing against civilian targets. Some had wondered if this was retaliation for the attack on the Kerch Bridge, that vitally symbolic part of Russia's infrastructure that feeds its occupation of Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula they illegally annexed in 2014, and the rest of their occupation in other parts of Ukraine. But Zaporizhzhians would say, frankly, we've been hit every day before that attack actually occurred. Russia beginning to explain its position after that attack. Russia's President Vladimir Putin meeting the head of his investigative committee and saying that as a result of the report he'd received from that committee, they believe that the Ukrainian secret services were responsible with the help of what he referred to as foreigners. It's still unclear exactly how this explosion occurred. Was it a truck bomb? Was something else involved? The damage has been significant, I think it's fair to say, but Russian state media being very clear in their mind that they're able to get cars moving across the damaged road areas of that, and that the rail traffic has resumed. It's so vital for Russia's supply of its troops in the south of Ukraine, a supply that's already been, frankly, atrocious and part of why its positions are slowly collapsing. But there will be an important meeting in Moscow tomorrow of Russia's Security Council. Yes, they happen weekly, but this particular one of great emphasis. We may learn exactly what Russia's response will be from this attack. This, to Vladimir Putin, was a bridge of great significance. He opened it personally in 2018 by driving a truck across it. The idea that Ukraine could attack it, startling, frankly, in terms of a sign of their capabilities versus the lapses in Russia's security capabilities, but also, too, having many concerns as to what escalation Russia might bring. Russia's spokesperson for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, was asked whether this may invoke part of Russia's nuclear doctrine about defending its own territory. His response to that question was inappropriate. So we don't really know where this is going. We know that Russia's losing day after day after day on the battlefield in terms of the symbolism of major infrastructure being attacked. We'll have to wait and see what the Kremlin response is tomorrow. Jim?
All right, Nick Paton-Walsh, thank you very much for that report. And joining me now to discuss is retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. General Kimmitt, thanks for being with us. We appreciate it. It really seems Russia is hell-bent on retaliating for the humiliation suffered by that bridge being blown up. What do you see right now when you take a look at what the Ukrainians were able to pull off, as Nick Paton-Walsh was talking about a few moments ago, and then what appears to be an act of Russian retaliation going after civilians as they've done time and again?
Yeah, first of all, Jim, it's hard to believe that this was not a Ukrainian operation. Within 24 hours, they were already issuing a stamp with an attack on the Crimean Bridge put on the stamp. So pretty conclusive to me that that was done by the Ukrainians. With regards to the retaliation, I think that comes at the same time you've got General Surovikin taking over the entire operations inside of Ukraine. He's well known to be, like his predecessor Dvornikov, a veteran of Syria. He was the one that was accused of doing the massive bombing inside of Aleppo. So I suspect he's coming in not only to prove that they can respond to the attack on the bridge, but also to demonstrate what a tough commander he's going to be of all the Ukrainian forces, all the Russian forces inside of Ukraine.
And even before everything that happened this weekend, and it's been a lot, President Biden was warning of nuclear Armageddon. The White House wants Putin to come to the negotiating table. But I guess I was wondering, what did you make of the president's remark? Are we getting into that kind of a critical stage? What did you think?
Well, I think it was an unfortunate choice of words. I certainly don't want to diminish the use of a nuclear weapon inside of Ukraine, but the fact remains there's a big step between using a tactical nuclear weapon inside of Ukraine and thermonuclear war with strategic weapons between Russia and the United States and the free world. The biggest problem, of course, of the use of tactical nuclear weapons is it would be reducing a threshold that has been in place since 1945.
But do you think Putin could go that route, that he might employ these tactical nuclear weapons out of just sheer desperation?
Well, it's Russian doctrine that if, in fact, Russian property, Russian territory is attacked, that the use of nuclear weapons is an appropriate response. I would remind everyone that we used to have very, very small tactical nuclear weapons that were about 100 pounds and ranged about 850 meters. It should not be the end of the world. It should not lead to nuclear war. We better, although, have some very, very significant responses to Putin and his forces if those weapons are released on the battlefield.
And we're hearing these stories of Russian soldiers being completely ill-equipped. It's almost comical in some cases. In one case, they moved into a pig shed in Kherson because they didn't have anywhere else to stay. We're seeing videos of Russian officers telling troops they will have to bring their own sleeping bags and telling them that they are fit for the Russian draft, even if they have hernias or plates in their heads. What does that say about the ability of the Russian military right now and how it's been degraded by the Ukrainians?
Well, two things I'd say. First of all, it's pretty embarrassing to see how they're treating their troops. However, I'd also note that I commanded Russian troops that were working with our brigade inside of Bosnia in 1997-98. They are used to operating on a scale of privation that American troops just wouldn't accept. We had nothing but cold showers. They had nothing but cold showers in the middle of winter. They had very poor food. So this is the Soviet-Russian way of war. Don't take care of your troops and just make them fight.
Wow. And Forbes is reporting that 700,000 Russians have fled since the draft was announced. What do you, I mean, I'm sure you've seen these images of these Russians, you know, fleeing and crossing into places all around the former Soviet Union, into these neighboring countries. Do you think that this spells cracks in Putin's power?
Well, what it indicates is that the war has now come to the people of Russia. He tried to keep this as a special military operation focused inside of Ukraine with a small number of troops. That is over. Now that he's gone to mobilization of the reservists, people back in Moscow and the outlying cities understand that this war is now their war, and some are voting with their feet. That is not good for President Putin. One questions whether an autocrat really worries about public opinion. If he does, he should be concerned.
And apparently, General Kimmitt, he's going to be meeting with his national security team in the next day or so. Is there any hope, I mean, I hesitate to even ask this question, that anybody is going to talk sense to Vladimir Putin, give him any sense of what the reality of the situation is, or he just doesn't want to hear that?
You know, this is starting to resemble Hitler in his bunker in 1945, taking advice from his commanders on the ground, none of who thought that there was any chance that they were going to win, and as they did, sort of temporize their words to the dictator for fear of their own lives for telling the truth. I would imagine that that is the same concern of his advisors, because candidly, if Putin goes down, his hand-selected advisors are going with him. So I would suspect he's going to hang in there, regardless of what the advisors say, and frankly, I don't think the advisors are going to give him the advice that he needs.
Fascinating, and the comparisons are interesting. We'll be watching, of course. General Mark Kimmitt, thanks so much. We appreciate it.